This is a video about one of the most important yet overlooked concepts in all of psychology. It affects everything from your golf game, whether or not you get hired, to how long people get sent to prison. It affects the outcome of a sports game, a stock investment, or whether you get into university. No matter who you are or what you do, your future is directly and meaningfully affected by this concept. What concept am I talking about? Noise. Noise is the subject of Daniel Kahneman's second book, the first of which was the highly influential international bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. Noise is a term used in statistics to describe variability within a sample. A good way to understand this is to think about shooting a target. When shooting at a target, you're obviously trying to aim for the center. So if all of your shots land in a tight group in the center, that means that you're a very accurate shot. But if all of your shots land in a tight group off to the side of the center, then that means that you are a biased shot. You're very consistent in the way that you shoot, but you're consistently wrong in roughly the same way. But this is what noise looks like. It's when your shots are very inaccurate, and they're also inaccurate in different ways. There's no clear pattern to where your shots will land on the target. The main argument of noise the authors make is that historically in behavioral science, we've been too focused on the concept of bias. For example, in financial decision-making, behavioral scientists will often try to correct for the bias of people favoring smaller short-term payoffs over longer-term gains. And while the authors don't deny that this work is important, they argue that at least an equal amount of importance should be paid towards noise, because they say that noise is also a very big problem in people's decision making that doesn't get enough attention. And while the authors don't deny that this work is important, they argue that at least an equal amount of importance should be paid towards noise, because they say that noise is also a very big problem in people's decision making that doesn't get enough attention. Now, one reason for this, the authors suggest, is because people assume that noise will simply cancel itself out. If you're a little to the left on one case and a little to the right on the other case, then on average you should be pretty accurate and in the middle. However, what the authors point out is that sometimes noise cannot correct itself in this way, and that every time that you're inaccurate, it's very costly. One example of this for me that immediately sprung to mind is, imagine you are playing a game of golf and you're trying to putt. When putting, you have to be extremely accurate with how much power you put behind the ball. Too much power and your ball will simply roll over the hole, and too little power and your ball will stop short before it reaches its target. In this case, the amount of power that you apply to your putt is very noisy. You overshot it on the first time and undershot it on the second time. But these two shots don't cancel each other out. Instead, you just scored 2 extra shots on your score, and so this noise is actually very costly to you. But noise can affect things that are far more serious than a simple game of golf, like hiring decisions. Imagine a company has 2 open positions for the same job, and then 2 almost identical candidates apply for that very job. They're called Jack and James. When Jack goes for his interview, his interviewer is in a good mood, and as a result of that, the interviewer thinks that the interview went very well, and Jack is put forward for the job. However, when it comes to James, James was more unlucky. His interviewer was in a bad mood, and as a result was a lot more harsh with their criteria, and James was not put forward for that second role. Now, not only is this unfair on James, who was denied the opportunity to get the job, even though he is just as qualified as Jack, but it's also costly for the company, because now the company has dismissed a perfectly good candidate to fill that second position and has to spend more money and time looking for a candidate just like James to fill that very position. So as I hope you can tell, noisy systems are unfair and expensive, and fixing them would be a great thing to do. But before you can fix them, you need to be able to diagnose what exactly is the cause of the noise that you're experiencing in your system. And the authors of the book outline the 3 different types of noise. The first type of noise they call level noise. So this is when individuals within your system are in general either more positive or more pessimistic than the other, or just generally one is more biased and the other is more biased the other way. Take, for example, going for an interview. There are 2 interviewers in your team. One is called Liz and the other is called Jane. Liz, in general, is very optimistic, and so when she receives a candidate, she's far more likely to put them forward for the role afterwards. However, Jane is a lot more pessimistic and strict, and so if you get an interview with Jane, you're just far less likely to be put forward for that job. Individually, these 2 interviewers are biased, but together they form a noisy system, which means that equally qualified candidates might have very different outcomes depending on which of these 2 interviewers they end up with. The second type of noise is called pattern noise. So this is when that individuals are biased not in general, like level noise, but biased towards specific cases for a specific reason. Let's take our interviewer example again. Imagine that Liz in the past had hired a former soldier, but that former soldier turned out to be a very problematic employee who later got fired for an extremely big scandal at the company. With that memory in mind, Liz might be more biased against former soldiers who apply for her job. On the other hand, Jane, who had no such experience, may not have the same bias that Liz does. As a result of that, if you're a former soldier who applies for this company, then your chance of getting the job is extremely noisy, depending on whether you get Liz or Jane as your interviewer. So the third type of noise, and the one that perhaps feels the most unfair, is called occasion noise. So occasion noise is when the outcome of your treatment is determined by totally arbitrary and transient factors that are totally out of your control. Like, for example, the weather. If we keep using the example of applying for a job, imagine that Liz has to travel in one day through the rain because it was pouring that very morning of your interview. That might put her in a worse mood because she's all soaking wet, and so by the time you do your interview, she's in a bad mood, lowering your chances of getting that job. Whereas if you go for an interview on a nice, bright, dry and sunny day, that might put Liz in a better mood, meaning that you're more likely to get that job. Another example of an occasion that shouldn't affect noise but unfortunately does is the outcome of sports matches. Yep. Sports matches. Imagine that Jane is the supporter of Liverpool Football Club, who earlier that day lost their game. That's going to put Jane in a far worse mood than if Liverpool had won the game. As a result of that, your chances of getting through that interview are lower because, well, Jane's just in a bad mood because of the sports. Now, you might think that a real professional wouldn't let something like that affect their judgment, but you'd be wrong. In fact, studies have been done on this very phenomenon, and according to the authors of Noise, this has actually been seen in the most serious of all cases, the courtroom. What the authors of Noise say is that judges give much more harsh sentences if their local football team has lost the game that very day. But if the local team won the game, they gave much lighter and more lenient sentences. So now you know what noise is, why it's a problem, and the different types of noise that exist. Let's now talk about some solutions. In the book, the authors give many different ways to reduce noise. Far too many for me to talk about in this video. So I'm just going to talk to you about 3 of what I think are some of the most practical suggestions for reducing noise. The first way to reduce noise is to use a computer algorithm. The authors argue that algorithms in general are a lot less noisy than human judgment. And that's because algorithms and computers are not subject to the same things like mood and time of day and so on. In fact, the authors even cite a study that suggests that even sloppily put together algorithms that just use very basic calculations are far more consistent and less noisy than human judgments. Authors argue that wherever possible, we should be trying to use less human judgment and more algorithms. But what if you can't really use an algorithm for the type of decision you're trying to make? Well, here are some more suggestions. So another way to reduce noise is to improve what the authors call your decision hygiene. There are many ways to do this, but you can do things like, for example, break the decision up into separate components, then score each component on a specific scale, and then have a certain threshold that your candidate or person needs to cross over in order to be approved or receive a positive outcome from the decision. By breaking up a decision into these smaller components and scoring it in this more consistent way, that reduces the ability for noise to creep into the decision-making system and makes it a lot more consistent. In other words, the way that the system comes to a final decision is standardized rather than being subjective. And the third way to reduce noise is to use something called aggregate judgments. The idea behind this is that crowds in general are a lot less noisy than individuals. That's because in a crowd you'll have people with different biases on either side of the system, so when you average them together then they should be a lot more accurate and less noisy. This is especially powerful when each person in that group makes their decision independently rather than after talking to each other. This practice is important because it helps to reduce the effect of groupthink, where perhaps one charismatic leader may be able to lead the thinking of the entire group. So that's my summary of noise. Do I recommend the book? I actually do. I think that the book is full of really good ideas, as I've explained to you in today's video, and there are a lot more examples and solutions that I was not able to present in today's video that you can get if you read the book as a whole. I will say though, typical of Kahneman's writing, the book is extremely thick and dense, and the language at some points is extremely technical and boring, and I think you'd be forgiven for skipping over those parts. However, I think that the overall message of noise is extremely important, and it's something that I'm trying to apply in my own work as an applied behavioral scientist. So if you want to pick up a copy of Noise for yourself, I'll have a link to it in the description. And if you want to get fantastic book summaries, including a book summary of this book, Noise, then be sure to use my affiliate link for the service Shortform, which offers great book summaries. They're not sponsoring today's video, but I do have an affiliate program with them. And if you use their service, and it's a really great service, then I'll get a little bit of kickback and you help support this channel. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.